the gathering of the Free Me friends, my brothers and sisters, my fellow human beings. I come before you today not as a man apart, not as some singular specimen plucked from misery and put on display, but as a voice, one voice among the millions who have cried out from the darkness of bondage, from the fields soaked with their own blood, from the auction blocks where their children were torn from their arms, as casually as a farmer plucks a withered leaf from a vine. I stand here in the light of this day, a free man, and yet I must tell you, I must confess to you with every fiber of honesty within me, that the word free sits uneasily upon my tongue. For what does freedom mean when the shackles remain on my brothers? What does it mean when the lash still falls on the backs of those whose only crime was to be born with darker skin in a land that dares to call itself the home of liberty? What manner of freedom is it that knows a border, that says to a man, "You are free here"? Across that river, step across that line, and you become property again? I'd have traveled across this great nation and across the waters to the British Isles. I have stood before kings and queens in spirit, before parliaments of free men, before churches and lyceums and great halls, and everywhere I go, they ask me the same question, "Frederick, what is it like to be free?" And I tell them, I will tell you what it is like when every man, every woman, every child born upon this earth knows what freedom truly is. Until that hour, I am not yet free. None of us is. But I come to you today not merely to lament. I come to you today with a message forged in the furnace of my own suffering, tempered in the waters of my own deliverance, and held aloft by the unquenchable fire of hope that I believe God Himself has lit within the breast of every human soul. That message, friends, is this: freedom is not a gift that governments bestow. Freedom is not a privilege that the powerful grant to the weak out of mercy or benevolence. Freedom is the natural inheritance of every soul that breathes, and it cannot be owned. It cannot be chained. It cannot be sold. It can only be suppressed, and what is suppressed must, by the eternal law of nature and of God, rise again. I say to you, it will rise. It is rising. We are its rising, too, the testimony of a life. What I have seen, you may have read accounts of slavery in the newspapers. You may have heard the politicians debate it on the floors of Congress, parsed its economics, weighed its practicalities. But let me give you something no newspaper can print and no senator can legislate away. Let me give you the truth as I have lived it. I was born in Talbot County, Maryland. In a year I cannot tell you with certainty, because the enslaved are not permitted the dignity of knowing their own birthdays. My mother was Harriet Bailey, a woman of great intelligence and quiet strength, whom I saw only a handful of times in my life before she was taken from me by death. When I was still a small child, my father, well, they say he was a white man. They say he may have been my master. Such is the particular brutality of American slavery. It does not merely steal your labor. It steals your name, your family, your very origins. I grew up watching things that no child should witness. I watched my Aunt Hester strung up by her wrists from a ceiling joist and beaten until her screams faded into unconscious silence, her blood spattering the earthen floor of the kitchen. I watched old men bent double from years of labor who were given no rest, no medicine, no dignity in their final days. I watched mothers clutch their infants and weep, knowing that when the master needed money, those infants would be sold away and they would never hear their children's laughter again. And I watched something else. I watched the slave holders, those who called themselves Christians, who sat in their fine pews on Sunday mornings and sang hymns to a God of love. I watched them defend this system with sermons and scriptures, with laws and constitutions, with the smug confidence of men who have never for a single moment questioned whether they might be wrong. I learned to read, and that reading was my salvation and my damnation simultaneously. When I first encountered the word abolitionist in a newspaper I had stolen away to read in secret, I felt my heart seized with mingled terror and hope. When I read the debates in the Senate, I understood for the first time that there were people, white people, free people, who knew that what was being done to me and to the millions like me was wrong, and that knowledge was a seed that grew in the dark, fed by my tears and my fury, until it broke the soil and reached toward the light. My escape from slavery in 1838 was the first act of true self-determination I had ever committed. I had been told my entire life that I was property. Property does not have a will. Property does not plan. Property does not dream of Philadelphia. But I dreamed of Philadelphia. I planned for months. I borrowed the papers of a free black sailor. I dressed myself in a manner suited to a free man, because in my heart, I was always a free man. The chains were a lie pressed upon me by the powerful, and I walked away. Not every man could do what I did. Not every woman. The chains of slavery are not merely physical. They are psychological, spiritual, economic, legal. The entire machinery of American society was arrayed to keep the enslaved in bondage. The Fugitive Slave Act makes free states accomplices to the slave power. The law of this nation, a nation that inscribed all men are created equal on its founding document, the law of this nation says that I am property, that my children are property, that if you help me, you are a criminal. What kind of law is that? I will tell you what kind. It is the law of tyrants, and the history of this world teaches us one inescapable lesson about tyrants. They fall. 3. The meaning of freedom, what we fight for, what is freedom? I have asked myself this question 10,000 times. I'd have turned it over in my mind during the long nights of my captivity and during the long days of my liberation, and I have come to believe that freedom is not a single thing but a constellation of things, a gathering of dignities that together make a man or woman fully human. Freedom is the right to the fruit of your own labor. When a man rises before dawn and works until the stars appear, it is an outrage against heaven that the wages of that labor should be pocketed by another man who did nothing but hold a deed of ownership. The laborer deserves his hire. This is not a radical idea. It is inscribed in the very nature of honest work. And yet, across the fields of the American South, millions of human beings toil from the moment they can walk until the moment they can walk no more, and they see not a single penny of what their labor produces. Their masters grow rich, their families grow thin, and we call this civilization. Freedom is the right to your own family. There is no institution more sacred, more fundamental to human happiness than the family. Even the slaveholder knows this. Why else does he threaten to sell a man's children? When he wants to break his spirit, he knows that the love of a parent for a child is the most powerful force in the human heart. He weaponizes that love. He uses it as a leash. But I tell you, any society that treats the destruction of families as a business transaction, that puts a price on a mother's grief, that sells children at auction, that society has forfeited its claim to moral standing. Freedom is the right to educate yourself and your children. When I was enslaved, it was illegal to teach me to read. Do you understand what that means? The slave power was so terrified of what an educated black man might do that they made learning itself a crime. They understood something that I want you to understand. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is liberation. The moment I could read, I began to see my own condition with new eyes. I began to understand that the arguments made to justify my bondage were not the inevitable conclusions of reason, but the self-serving sophistries of men who profited from my ignorance. Education is the foundation of all freedom. Take it from a man, and you take everything. Freedom is the right to speak, to gather, to worship as your conscience directs, to petition your government for redress of grievances. These rights are enumerated in the Constitution of the United States, that magnificent, compromised, contradictory document, and yet they are denied to millions of American citizens by the color of their skin. I have been pelted with eggs and rotten fruit for daring to stand at a podium and speak. I have been beaten by mobs in the North, in the free North, for advocating the self-evident truth that human beings should not be bought and sold. This is the state of American freedom, and yet, I still believe in that freedom. Not the freedom that is, but the freedom that must be. The freedom that the founders gestured at when they were brave enough, or perhaps hypocritical enough, to write words larger than their own practice. All men are created equal for words that contain within them the seeds of the revolution we are fighting, for words that, if taken seriously, would transform this nation overnight, for words that slaveholders have spent 80 years trying to explain away, to qualify, to footnote into meaninglessness. But the words remain, and we will hold them to those words. If the enemies of freedom and their argumency would not be honest with you if I did not take a moment to address those who oppose us, not merely to condemn them, but to examine their arguments, because I believe that to defeat an enemy, you must first understand him. The slaveholder says, the Negro is not capable of freedom. He is, in a hierarchy of God's creation, placed below the white man, and to attempt to elevate him is to violate the divine order. This argument is as old as oppression itself. Every conqueror has said the same thing about the people he has conquered. The Romans said it of the barbarians. The Spanish said it of the peoples of the Americas. And now the American slaveholder says it of the African and his descendants. But I stand before you as the refutation of that argument. I was born into slavery. I was given no schooling, no advantages, no opportunities beyond what I seized for myself in secret. And I dare any man in this room, to debate me, to test my reasoning, to challenge my knowledge of history, philosophy, theology, or any subject he chooses. I say this not out of vanity, but out of necessity, because the slaveholder's argument rests on the premise that the enslaved are incapable of the life of the mind. I am the proof that this is a lie. The slaveholder also says the economy of the South depends upon slave labor. To free the enslaved would destroy the Southern economy and bring ruin to the nation. This argument is the most nakedly cynical of all. It says, in plain language, that profit justifies bondage, that the balance sheet is a higher moral authority than the human soul. It is the argument of a man who, having stolen your horse, tells you that he cannot return it because he has grown dependent on the horse for transportation. The theft is not thereby made just. And furthermore, and I want you to mark this well, The argument about the economy of slavery is an argument that cuts directly against the slave. Who has produced that wealth? Whose labor built those great plantation houses, cultivated those fields of cotton and tobacco, nursed those children and cooked those meals and made possible the entire grand edifice of Southern prosperity? The enslaved have been working without wages for generations. The debt that is owed them is incalculable. If we are talking about economic justice, the entire South owes its enslaved laborers compensation that no reparation could fully cover. Then there are those who say, let us be patient. Let change come gradually. Agitation only hardens the hearts of the slaveholders and makes emancipation less likely. This argument is made by people who are not enslaved. Patience is a luxury of the free. When a man is being beaten, the question how quickly should we stop the beating has only one answer: now, immediately, without qualification or delay. To counsel patience to the enslaved is to counsel patience to the drowning man. There is no gradualism in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I have heard these arguments in parlors and churches and legislative chambers. I have heard them from men who called themselves Christians, from men who called themselves defenders of the Constitution, from men who called themselves reasonable and moderate and practical. And I say to all of them, there is nothing reasonable about human bondage. There is nothing moderate about the auction block. There is nothing practical about the immortal soul of a human being. Beat the Constitution and the promise, America's unfinished workie. Have a complicated relationship with the founding documents of this nation. There are those among my abolitionist brothers and sisters, and I count Garrison among the most sincere and devoted of freedom's champions, who look at the Constitution and see only its compromises, its 3/5 clause, its protection of the slave trade until 1808, its fugitive slave provisions. They say the Constitution is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and that no honest man can swear allegiance to it. I understand that view. I have held it myself, but I have come to a different conclusion, and I want to share it with you today, because I think it matters enormously for the strategy of our movement. The Constitution of the United States, when read in its entirety, when its preamble is given its full weight, when its principles are taken seriously rather than selectively, that Constitution is, at its heart, an anti-slavery document. We the people, not we the white people, not we the free people, not we the property-owning people, we the people. The preamble speaks of establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, promoting the general welfare, and securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Our posterity. Posterity includes my children. It includes the children of every enslaved man and woman in this nation. The slaveholders have captured the Constitution. They have bent its words to their purposes. They have filled the Supreme Court with men who read all men are created equal, and somehow do not see themselves in those words the way I see myself in them. But the Constitution belongs to all Americans, and reclaiming it, insisting upon its true meaning, holding this nation to the standard it set for itself, that is not capitulation. That is the deepest form of radical action. This nation made a promise. It wrote that promise in the most exalted language that political philosophy has ever produced. And then it broke that promise systematically, comprehensively, across 3 centuries and the backs of millions of human beings. What we are fighting for is not the overthrow of America. What we are fighting for is the fulfillment of America, the America that should have been, the America that could be, the America that must be if this experiment in self-government is to be anything more than an elaborate justification for the rule of the powerful over the weak. I believe in that America. I fight for that America. And on the darkest nights, when I read the newspapers and see the expansion of slavery into new territories, when I see the Fugitive Slave Act being enforced on the streets of Boston and New York, when I see my people suffering, on those nights I hold on to that belief, like a man holds onto a rope over deep water, because I have nothing else, and because it is true.vi, the role of the church. A reckoning with religione must speak plainly about the church. I must, because the church has been the greatest disappointment of my life as a free man. When I was enslaved, the overseers who beat us most cruelly were often the most loudly religious. My master was a Methodist of some distinction. He attended camp meetings and testified to the saving grace of Jesus Christ, and then returned home to manage his human property with a whip. I watched this contradiction, and it nearly destroyed my faith entirely. Now that I move in the free world, I find that much of the organized church is scarcely better. The Southern churches provide theological justification for slavery. They have produced an entire library of argument designed to prove that the Bible sanctions the ownership of human beings. They cite Ham. They cite Paul's letters. They construct elaborate hermeneutics to launder the gospel of love into a defense of the lash. And the northern churches, too many of them, remain silent. They preach a comfortable gospel that does not disturb the comfortable. They welcome slaveholders into their communion. They counsel patience. They worry about schism. They decide that the unity of the denomination is more important than the unity of humanity. I want to be clear. I distinguish between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land. The Christianity of Christ is radical. It is on the side of the poor, the oppressed, the prisoner, the outcast. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. If Christ walked the streets of Charleston today, do you think you would attend services at the First Church of the Planters? Or do you think you would be found in the slave quarters, binding up wounds and telling the children that God sees them and loves them, and has not forgotten them? I believe the latter, and I call upon the churches of this nation, north and south, black and white, to choose the Christianity of Christ or the Christianity of the slaveholder. You cannot serve both. The scripture itself tells you that you cannot serve two masters. Choose. There are those who have chosen rightly. There are Quakers who have put their lives and fortunes on the line to conduct the Underground Railroad. There are Methodist and Presbyterian ministers who have gone to prison for preaching that God made all men equal. There are congregations across the North that serve as stations on the road to freedom. To them I say, God bless you. History will vindicate you. Continue. But to those who remain silent, who decide that theology is to contested and politics to divisive, and who take refuge in a privatized faith that asks nothing and risks nothing, to them I say, your silence is not neutrality. Your silence is complicity. When a crime is being committed in plain sight, the man who looks away is not innocent. He is an accessory.vii. The women of the movement, a tribute long overdue I, would be guilty of a grave injustice if I spoke this long about freedom without acknowledging those who have been its most fearless champions, the women of this movement. Let me speak first of Harriet Tubman, though she would not thank me for the praise. being a woman more interested in action than in accolades. This woman, born into bondage in Maryland as I was, not only secured her own freedom, but returned again and again into the jaws of slavery to bring others out. 13 missions, approximately 70 people freed, not one lost. She said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She moved in darkness and in danger, with a pistol in her belt and the North Star in her heart, as she is more a soldier for freedom than any general I have ever read about. Let me speak of Sojourner Truth, Isabella Balfrey, once enslaved in New York, who took a new name and a new life and went forth to speak truth to power with a directness and a force that shamed all lesser orators. When they challenged her womanhood at that convention in Akron, when they said a woman was too delicate, too weak for the rough and tumble of public life, she rose and answered them with the truth of her own scarred body. "Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, and ain't I a woman?" Let me speak of the women who organized the anti-slavery societies, who went door to door with petitions when petitioning was thought unladylike, who held bazaars and fundraisers, who wrote letters and pamphlets, who hosted fugitives at risk of their own arrest. The machinery of this movement runs on their labor, and they rarely receive the credit they deserve. I have been a supporter of women's suffrage, and I remain so. The argument for women's right to vote is the same argument as the one for the abolition of slavery. It is wrong to exclude a class of human beings from self-governance on the basis of a characteristic they did not choose and cannot change. Sex, like race, is not a measure of a person's capacity for reason, moral judgment, or civic participation. The franchise belongs to all. Some of my colleagues in the movement tell me that I should keep these causes separate. That yoking women's rights to abolition complicates the politics and may lose us allies. I understand the tactical concern, but I cannot in good conscience argue for the full humanity of the enslaved, while denying the full humanity of half the human race. The principles are the same. The cause is one. VIII. It were to the enslaved. To those who cannot hear Menno, I want to speak to someone who is not in this room, someone who cannot be in this room, because they are still held in bondage, still working the fields and the kitchens and the docks of the slave-holding states. I want to speak to them as if they could hear me, and perhaps, in some way I do not understand, they can talk to you, my brothers and sisters in chains, you whose names I do not know but whose faces I see when I close my eyes. I say, you are not forgotten. This movement, these people gathered here and in halls like this one across the free states, across the Atlantic, they are fighting for you. They know your worth. They know your humanity. They know that the system that holds you is a lie, and they are working to expose that lie and dismantle it. I say to you what I wish someone had said to me in those dark years. Your suffering is not your destiny. The degradation that has been visited upon you is not who you are. It is what has been done to you. Those are different things. What has been done to you can be undone. What you are, what you truly are, is what cannot be taken from you, no matter how much they try. You are human beings. You have minds that think and hearts that love and souls that long for something better. You are created in the image of God. This is what I believe, what I stake my life and my argument upon, and the image of God cannot be owned, cannot be auctioned, cannot be whipped into submission. It can be suppressed. It can be beaten down, but it persists. It persists in every mother who sings to her child in the darkness. It persists in every man who keeps his dignity even when stripped of everything else. It persists in you, and to those among you who dream of running, who lie awake at night calculating the distance to the North Star, I will not tell you what to do. Only you know the circumstances of your bondage, the risks you face, the people you would be leaving behind. But I will tell you this, it can be done. I did it. Others have done it. The road is hard and the danger is real, but on the other side of that danger is a life, your life, lived on your own terms. And there are people on that road waiting to help you. Run if you can. Fight if you must. And if you can do neither, survive. Endure. Hold on to your humanity with both hands. Because the day is coming. I believe the day is coming when this system will end. When the law of this land will match the law of God. When your children, or your children's children, will grow up free. Survive for that day. It is coming. IX. A word to white Americans. The challenge before y'all, and now I turn to my white brothers and sisters in this struggle, and to those white Americans who have not yet joined it, but who, I hope, may be moved to do so. I know that many of you are good people. I know that many of you find slavery repugnant, that you are troubled by it in a general way, that you believe it is wrong. I want to say to you with all the respect and all the urgency I possess, general trouble is not enough. Being troubled by slavery while taking no action against it is the moral equivalent of being troubled by a drowning child while standing on the riverbank doing nothing. The question before every white American today is this: which side are you on? Not in theory, in practice. Not in your private conscience, in your public life. The slaveholder is not troubled by your private conscience. He is troubled only by your votes, your dollars, your voice in the public square, your willingness to shelter a fugitive, your refusal to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act, your determination to elect men who will end this evil. Some of you tell me that you are sympathetic to the cause, but that political realities prevent you from taking stronger positions. You worry about your party, your district, your livelihood. I understand these concerns. I do not dismiss them, but I want you to hold them up against what I have told you today, against the image of my Aunt Hester, against the image of a mother watching her child sold away from her, and ask yourself whether those political concerns are proportionate to the moral stakes. You have something I did not have, the vote. You have something I still do not have in full measure, the protection of the law. You have something that all the eloquence in the world cannot substitute for, power. And power, in a democracy, carries responsibility. You can change this. The question is whether you will. I ask you to support candidates who oppose the expansion of slavery and work toward its abolition. I ask you to refuse to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act, to regard its provisions as the moral obscenity they are, and to let your conscience, not your fear of prosecution, guide your actions. I ask you to support the organizations working for abolition with your money and your time. I ask you to educate yourselves and your children about the reality of slavery, not the sanitized version, not the paternalistic fiction of the happy slave, but the truth. And I ask you to examine your hearts for the prejudice that lives there, that has been placed there by a culture that has spent generations teaching you. That dark skin is a sign of inferiority. It is not the truth. It was never the truth. It is a lie maintained by power, because power requires justifications. Examine that lie. Pull it out by the root. Because a movement for freedom that does not examine its own prejudices will reproduce them. X the vision. What freedom looks like, let me close, or nearly close, by painting you a picture, not of where we are, but of where we are going, not of the America that is, but of the America that must be. I see an America where a child born in Georgia and a child born in Massachusetts have the same rights before the law and the same opportunities before life, where the color of a man's skin no more determines his destiny than the color of his eyes, where a woman may speak and vote and own property and live in accordance with her own intelligence and will, where a laborer receives fair wages for honest work and may not be compelled to labor for the enrichment of another. I see an America where the schoolhouse stands open to every child, white and black, rich and poor, and where the promise of education is not a privilege of birth, but the birthright of citizenship, where the university welcomes the student who works hardest and thinks most clearly, regardless of who their parents were or where they were born, where knowledge is understood as the common property of humanity, not the exclusive domain of those who can pay for it. I see an America where the church preaches the full gospel, not the comfortable parts, not the parts that justify the existing order, but the radical, disruptive, transforming truth that God loves the poor and the outcast and the prisoner and the stranger, and that to serve God is to serve them, where preachers speak truth to power even when power fills the pews. I see an America that is honest about its history, that does not paper over its crimes with patriotic mythology, but faces them squarely as a patient faces a wound, not to wallow in the pain, but to understand its cause and begin the healing. A nation that can say we were wrong, we did evil, and here is what we are doing to make it right. That is not weakness. That is the only path to genuine strength. I see an America that has finally, truly, lived up to its founding promise, where all men are created equal is not an aspiration or an irony, but a description, where the Declaration of Independence is not a historical curiosity, but a living standard, by which each generation measures itself and finds itself accountable. Is this a dream? Yes, it is a dream, but it is a dream grounded in the nature of human beings, in what we are capable of, at our best. And I have seen enough of human nature, in the depths of its cruelty and in the heights of its courage, to know that we are capable of it. I have seen slaveholders repent and become abolitionists. I have seen white men and women risk imprisonment to shelter the fugitive. I have seen communities of free black Americans build schools and churches and businesses, and families of extraordinary dignity in the face of extraordinary oppression. I know what human beings can do when they choose the better angels of their nature. The dream is not naive. The dream is the strategy. Because you cannot build towards something you cannot envision. Because hope is not the opposite of realism. It is the precondition for the effort that makes better things real. The cost. What freedom requires of you would not be honest. I would not be worthy of your trust or your time if I pretended that the road ahead is easy. It is not. The slaveholder will not surrender his property without a fight. The political interests arrayed in defense of slavery are powerful and entrenched. The cultural habits of racial hierarchy run deep in this nation, north and south, in the hearts of people who would be horrified to think of themselves as racists. The path to the America I have described is long, and it passes through territory that will test our courage, our unity, and our faith. There will be days when the news is bad, when the Supreme Court rules against us, when a free black man is dragged back into slavery on the streets of a northern city, when the slave-holding territories expand, when the politicians we trusted turn out to be politicians first and men of principle second. There will be days like those, and on those days, the temptation will be to despair, to conclude that the system is too powerful, the opposition too entrenched, the human heart too susceptible to its own worst instincts. I have felt that despair. I know its weight, but I have also felt something else, something I want to give you today as the most important thing I have to give. I have felt the stubborn, irrational, inextinguishable certainty that justice is not merely desirable, but inevitable, that the arc of history, to borrow a phrase, bends toward justice, even when it seems to be bending the other way, that God, or nature, or the logic of human progress, whatever name you give to the force that moves history, is not on the side of the oppressor. Empires built on injustice have fallen, every one. The Roman Empire that crucified Jesus of Nazareth is gone. The Spanish Empire that enslaved the Americas is gone. The British Empire that grew fat on the slave trade has been forced to reckon with itself. And history is not finished with it yet. And this American slave system, this peculiar institution, as they call it, peculiar only in the sense that it requires so many peculiar contortions of logic to defend, this too will end. I do not know when. I do not know how. I know only that it will. And I know that the speed with which it ends depends on us, on what we do with our days, our voices, our votes, our money. Our courage dots of the cost of freedom is this: the willingness to spend what you have in service of it. Not all of you will be called to the same sacrifice. Not all of you can or should do the same things. Some of you will organize. Some will write. Some will vote. Some will shelter the fugitive. Some will educate their children differently than they were educated. Some will simply refuse, quietly, stubbornly, powerfully, to participate in the dehumanization of their fellow human beings. Every act matters. Every witness counts. XII, the peroration of free people's call to action, me friends. The hour is late, and I have spoken long, but I will not sit down without speaking the words that I have saved for last, the words that I carry with me always. The words that get me out of bed in the morning and keep me standing at podiums like this one. When I am tired and discouraged and far from home, freedom is not a destination. It is a practice. It is something you do every day with every choice. It is the practice of seeing the humanity in every person you encounter, especially the ones you have been taught to look past, to look through, to look away from. It is the practice of speaking truth when silence would be safer. It is the practice of acting on your convictions when action is costly. It is the practice of hope when despair would be easier. I practiced it from the moment I first held a newspaper in my hands and felt the world open up inside me. I practice it in every speech I give, every book I write, every meeting I attend, every fugitive I help. I will practice it until my last breath, because I know that nothing less will do, that a freedom you do not actively practice, actively defend, actively extend to others, is a freedom that withers to every person in this room who is free by whatever measure, in whatever degree. I say, use it. Do not hoard it. Freedom shared is freedom multiplied. Freedom withheld is freedom diminished. The only way to have more freedom in this world is to give more of it away. To every person in this room who doubts, who wonders whether the movement can succeed, whether the cause is just, whether their individual contribution makes a difference, I say, I am standing before you as proof. I began as property. I began as a child on a slave's pallet, watching my aunt bleed and teaching myself to read by firelight. No one looked at that child and thought he would one day stand before free men and women and speak truth to power. But here I am. That is not a story about Frederick Douglass. That is a story about what freedom does when it is allowed to grow. That is a story about what human beings are capable of when the system that has conspired to diminish them is, even slightly, removed. Imagine what this country would look like if that system were entirely removed. Imagine what we would discover about human potential, black and white, man and woman, north and south, if we finally kept the promises we made to ourselves in 1776. We will keep them. We must keep them. And we will keep them because there is no alternative that any person of conscience can accept. Because the alternative is the continuation of a system that is a moral catastrophe, a democratic contradiction, and a spiritual disgrace. Because this nation, for all its failures, contains within it the seeds of something remarkable, a republic that actually lives up to its ideals, and those seeds are worth fighting for. Fight with your voice. Fight with your vote. Fight with your dollar and your time and your shelter and your silence broken. When silence is complicity. Fight with the love you bear your children, extended to the children of every race and condition. Fight with the faith you hold, if you hold it, that there is a moral universe and that moral universes correct themselves, however slowly, however painfully. The slaveholder is powerful. The system is entrenched. The road is long, but we are not alone, and we are not wrong. And in the end, in the long end, the end that history will write, those who stood on the side of freedom will be vindicated, and those who stood against it will be ashamed. I intend to be on the right side of that judgment. I ask you to be there with me. Freedom, my friends. Freedom for all. Now and forever. I thank you.